February 20, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, the fuel gauge needle hovered just above empty as Colonel Hans Gayog, Hildebrandt's command vehicle, rolled over the ridge, giving him a clear view of the deserted American supply depot. Hildebrandt, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, lowered his field glasses, then raised them again. He was sure the morning sun had to be playing tricks on his eyes. But no, he wasn't seeing things. Laid out beneath him, row after row of fuel drums, stacked with that unmistakable American order, flashed in the dawn light like treasure. His division had been running on fumes, rationing every last drop when they stumbled upon what the retreating U.S. Second Corps had left behind in their dash through Kasserine Pass. 57,000 gallons of fuel, more gasoline than his entire division usually got from Germany in 2 months. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, the Afrika Korps intelligence officer, would later write in his memoirs, "We found more petrol in one American dump than most German divisions had seen since El Alamein. The Americans had fled and left enough fuel to run our whole army for days. What kind of enemy is so rich they can just walk away from that?" That moment at Kasserine Pass wasn't just a windfall, it was a gut punch. The Americans had so much stuff that what they threw away was more than the Wehrmacht could haul across the Mediterranean on a good month. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions had just handed Germany its biggest tactical win against U.S. forces in North Africa, capturing supplies that, for a short while, gave them a new lease on life. But hidden in that victory was a simple, brutal truth. The math didn't lie. Modern war came down to fuel, how much you used versus how much you had, and those numbers told a story that battlefield brilliance couldn't change. By February 1943, the Afrika Korps had desert warfare down to an art. 2 years of hard fighting had turned them into legends. Under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, they'd pushed the British back into Egypt, earned Montgomery's grudging respect, and turned North Africa into a showcase for German tactics. But every win now felt a little hollow, measured against a shrinking pool of resources. Fuel needed versus fuel on hand. The Wehrmacht's own records from late 1942 spelled out the crisis in black and white. The German-Italian force in North Africa needed 250 tons of supplies every month for its 65,000 aligned men. Just fuel alone took up 17,500 tons, more than half. But the supply convoys across the Mediterranean were getting slaughtered. Planes and submarines based on Malta sank 60 to 70% of Axis supply ships by early 1943, and what little made it ashore still had to travel 1,500 kilometers to the front, burning up more fuel than it delivered along the way. The desert's hunger for fuel blew all the old European calculations to pieces. A single panzer division needed 350 tons of supplies daily in combat. To move just 1 ton forward took 5 tons of fuel. Tank crews became masters at saving every drop, coasting down hills with engines off, push-starting vehicles to spare the batteries, siphoning fuel from wrecks with almost religious determination. Rommel himself said it in January 1943, "Our operations are decided more by the petrol gauge than by tactical requirements." He wasn't exaggerating. It was cold, hard math. The Afrika Korps had just 3 days of fuel left at El Alamein when Montgomery attacked. By February, even though they were closer to the ports, things were even worse. Then came the morning of February 14, 1943. Field Marshal Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim launched their big offensive against the Americans, dug in across central Tunisia, Operation Frühlingswind, Spring Wind, sent General Friedrich von Broik's 10th Panzer Division and Colonel Hildebrandt's 31st Panzer pushing through the Fide Pass towards Sidi Bouzid. It was the Afrika Korps' last big armoured assault, a last-ditch effort to smash the Allies before their supply advantage became impossible to overcome. The attack caught the Americans flat-footed. More than 100 German tanks and assault guns backed by mechanized infantry crashed into the positions held by the U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A. The Americans, spread thin on scattered hilltops, couldn't support each other. Their M3 Grant and Lee tanks, tall and clumsy with hull-mounted main guns, went down fast under the weight of German tactics honed by 3 years of war. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, leading the 1st Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, lost 44 out of 51 tanks in that first fight at Sidi Bouzid. The destruction was swift and thorough. The German veterans pulled off their maneuvers like they'd done it 100 times before. Meanwhile, the American crews, most of them new to battle, rushed in scattered straight into a wall of fire. Even with the upper hand, the Germans are still obsessed over fuel. Panzer IV companies left behind perfectly good tanks just because they ran out of gas. There's a bitter sort of irony in that, smashing the enemy, but unable to chase them down, winning fights you can't capitalize on, all because the fuel gauge sat on empty. February 17th, 1943, as American forces pulled back toward Kasserine Pass, they ditched their supply depots, built just like the U.S. Army manuals said, in ways that must have seemed like fantasy to German quartermasters. The Americans set up depots every 50 to 100 meters, each one packed with enough backup supplies to keep things running even if some were lost. Germans, who measured out every liter of fuel and counted every artillery shell, stumbled onto a level of abundance they could barely process. A recon patrol from the 21st Panzer Division found the first big depot near Speitler. According to the patrol leader, his report still sits in the Wehrmacht archives. The place was enormous, covering about 10 hectares, rows and rows of fuel drums, over 400 of them, each holding 55 gallons. Enough rations for what looked like an entire regiment for a month. Fresh white bread, canned meat, real coffee, chocolate, cigarettes by the thousands. Medical supplies they hadn't seen since 1941. German soldiers, half-starved and used to nibbling on Italian hardtack and acorn coffee, tore into those American rations like men possessed. The chocolate alone was more than most German civilians saw in a month. But the real prize was the fuel. Within hours, vehicles that had been dead in the water were suddenly roaring down the road again. Between February 19th and 20th, the Germans pushed through the narrow Fonduc Pass and overran the main American supply lines for the II Corps. What they found blew their minds and confirmed their worst fears. The haul was staggering: 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, 512 trucks and other vehicles, 57,000 gallons of gasoline and oil, and 45 tons of ammo. Just the fuel alone was almost enough to run the whole Afrika Korps for a week, more than some divisions had gotten in months. Rommel himself came to see the captured depots on February 21st. His aide, Hauptmann Heinz Schmidt, wrote down what happened. Rommel just stood there, silent, looking out over the mountain of supplies. Then he said softly, "Each American battalion is supplied better than our entire division. What kind of victory is this when the enemy can afford to lose more than we can afford to use?" In the short run, the captured vehicles were worth even more than the fuel. By February 1943, Wehrmacht records show that 85% of Rommel's transport ran on vehicles they'd taken from the British and Americans. The Americans' 2.5-ton trucks, Germans called them Jimmies, were especially valuable. They were tougher than the Opel Blitz trucks, easier to fix, and came abandoned with spare parts Germans hadn't seen in years. But the supplies told a story that went way beyond just stuff. They revealed two totally different ways of fighting a war. American doctrine, as the Germans learned from captured field manuals, was built on the idea of massive surplus as a kind of insurance. German divisions worked with 200 tons of supplies a day. American divisions got 700. That wasn't just about being richer, it was a whole different way of thinking about war. Talking to captured Americans only drove the point home. Captain William Baker from the 1st Armored Division said his battalion usually got everything they asked for, plus a 25% safety margin. When the Germans accused him of exaggerating, Baker just laughed. He said that was the bare minimum. The requisition forms they found backed him up. The numbers dwarfed what entire German divisions got in a month. General Friedrich von Broich, who led the 10th Panzer Division, summed it up in his report: "The enemy operates on principles foreign to our experience. They accept waste, plan for excess, and treat redundancy as essential. This isn't an army in the European sense. It's an industrial process that happens to include combat." The whole episode at Kasserine left the Germans with a strange sort of victory. Yes, they fixed their shortages, at least for a while, and kept moving. But the sheer scale of what they found made them realize something. Beating the Americans, at least in the long run, was a mathematical impossibility. The psychological shock ran deep. They even found medical supplies, penicillin, a miracle drug German hospitals couldn't get their hands on. They found chocolate and coffee in the rations, normal stuff for Americans. Meanwhile, their families back in Germany survived on turnips and fake coffee. The worst part? Captured documents made it clear these luxuries would be restocked in just a few weeks. Shipping manifests showed this depot was just one of many. A young officer from the 10th Panzer Division wrote home in a letter that survived: "We feast on American rations while our families starve. We burn American fuel while our homeland runs dry. We win battles by grabbing what our enemies throw away. This isn't victory, it's scavenging." Field Marshal Rommel completely changed his view of the Americans after Kasserine. At first, he thought they were badly trained, poorly equipped, and stuck with weak tactics. But after he saw the sheer amount of supplies they had, he realized skill mattered less than factories. In his report to OKW on February 22nd, Rommel wrote, part of it shows up in post-war histories, "The Americans are militarily inexperienced, but materially overwhelming. They learn from mistakes we can't afford. Time is on their side. Every day, they get stronger while we get weaker, no matter what happens on the battlefield." He saw the future clearly. We might win battles, but we can't win the war. The Americans don't win with genius moves. They win with math. They multiply their supplies, their gear, their attacks. We aren't fighting just soldiers. We're fighting America's entire industry. After Kasserine, the Afrika Korps depended more and more on captured supplies. This turned into a death spiral. Every push forward meant grabbing enemy stockpiles, so tactical plans became mad scrambles to scavenge enough to keep moving. By March 1943, Wehrmacht records looked bizarre. German crews driving Sherman tanks with black crosses painted on them, artillery batteries firing American 105mm shells, transport units running entirely on American trucks. The proud Afrika Korps had become, as one veteran later said, a parasitic army living off enemy leftovers. It got ridiculous. German mechanics used American wrenches and spare parts. Medical staff relied entirely on captured American supplies. Even staff cars ran on American fuel. There just wasn't enough left for combat vehicles, and even those were disappearing fast. The captured documents at Kasserine finally gave German intelligence a real look at American production. What they learned was staggering. One report from the Detroit tank arsenal showed 350 Sherman tanks built in January 1943 alone, more tanks in a single month than Germany built in 3. And the numbers kept climbing for America, while German output fell thanks to bombing and shortages. The math was brutal. America turned out 4,000 aircraft a month. Germany managed 2,000. America, 4,000 tanks. Germany, 500. America, 50,000 vehicles. Germany, 5,000. Major Hermann Kohl, an industrial engineer with the Afrika Korps, studied the documents and wrote a report that got buried. "We aren't fighting an army," he said. "We're fighting an entire continent's factories. Production numbers, not bravery, will decide who wins." The human side was just as unforgiving. The Afrika Korps lost experienced crews they couldn't replace. Americans showed up fresh, fully trained, with endless equipment. Lose a German tank, and you lose a crew. It took years to train. Lose an American tank and a new crew shows up in a week. The Germans intercepted a message. America was sending 5,000 replacement crews to North Africa every month. The Afrika Korps hadn't seen that many replacements total since El Alamein. The math of attrition was as cruel as the math of supply. All the captured equipment soon became a curse. American vehicles needed spare parts German shops couldn't make. Captured tanks required special tools no one had. So this mountain of gear started breaking down faster than the Germans could fix it. By April 1943, abandoned American vehicles littered German positions, not wrecked by battle, just worn out and impossible to repair. The Afrika Korps had grabbed more than it could ever use, and that pretty much summed up the whole North African campaign. General von Arnim took over in Tunisia after Rommel fell ill. He inherited a nightmare. His troops relied almost entirely on captured supplies they couldn't replace, their supply lines barely trickling in, burning precious fuel just to survive. His chief of staff didn't sugarcoat it. "We fought on borrowed time and stolen supplies against an enemy that never ran out of either. In the end, it wasn't tactics that decided things, it was math. We could win every skirmish and still lose ours just by the numbers." As the Germans pulled back into a shrinking corner around Tunis and Bizerte, they depended completely on whatever they could grab from the Americans. Some units ran entirely on seized American gear. Picture it, the Wehrmacht, fighting Americans with American weapons. By April 1943, the math was hopeless. The Germans needed 7,500 tons of supplies every month just to hold their ground. They got less than 1,000. The Americans, meanwhile, brought in 15,000 tons a day. That's not a typo. The supply advantage was over 450 to 1. On May 13th, 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered, along with the rest of the Axis troops in North Africa. More than 225,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. They didn't lose because the Americans outgeneraled them or because their enemies fought braver. They lost to the cold, relentless math of industrial war. Years later, veterans of the Afrika Korps would gather and look back on what all those captured supplies really meant. Friedrich Schultz, who led a panzer company, said it best in 1985, "We thought we'd won at Kasserine because we took the pass and the supplies, but those supplies just showed us the war was already lost." When your biggest victory is picking up what your enemy left behind, you're not winning, you're just putting off the end. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a supply officer with the 21st Panzer, put it this way in 1990, "The American fuel we captured meant everything for a few weeks, but nothing in the big picture. Our enemies measured fuel in shiploads. We measured it in drums. We were fighting infinity with scraps. The real story of Kasserine Pass isn't in the maneuvers or the maps, it's in the numbers the captured supplies revealed. The Germans got 12,000 gallons of fuel a month when it even arrived. At Kasserine, they captured 57,000 gallons from the Americans, but America shipped 15 million gallons to North Africa every month. America could replace what the Germans took in 2 weeks. For Germany, scraping together that much would take 6 months if nothing went wrong. No clever tactics could beat those numbers. The Afrika Korps saw their biggest tactical win at the exact moment they realized the bigger game was already lost. For the Americans, Kasserine Pass was a hard lesson, but they learned fast. They swapped out bad commanders, fixed their tactics, and started using their massive supply advantage the right way. In just a few weeks, a defeat turned into a lesson. For the Germans, Kasserine was a wake-up call. They'd won the fight, but learned they'd lost the war. The supplies they grabbed, those 57,000 gallons, those 183 tanks, the piles of food and ammo, kept them going for a bit, but only proved their defeat was just a matter of time. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, the campaign's intelligence officer, wrote in his memoir, "At Kasserine, we learned the Americans could afford to lose a battle. We couldn't afford to win one. They replaced their losses in weeks. We couldn't even replace our victories. This wasn't the war we knew. It was industrial mathematics in uniform." Kasserine exposed the real truth about World War II. It had become a contest of factories, not just soldiers. The Wehrmacht had always believed sharp tactics could make up for less stuff. In North Africa, they found out that if the other side could just outproduce you, all the skill in the world wouldn't save you. Captured American supplies showed off a production system Germans couldn't even imagine. Where Germany aimed for perfect efficiency, America just built in redundancy. Where Germans counted every bullet, Americans planned for waste. German planners calculated the bare minimum. Americans multiplied everything just in case. Captured American logistics manual called for shell expenditures bigger than what the Germans gave out for whole campaigns. American artillery could fire more shells in a day than entire German battalions got for an operation. To the Germans, it looked insane, even criminal, but nothing hurt morale more than seeing that American equipment wasn't just everywhere, it was often better. For soldiers who thought German engineering was unbeatable, that was a bitter pill to swallow. At first, German crews laughed at the Sherman tank, but out in the desert, the Shermans just kept running while the Panthers broke down. American radios actually worked. Their rations, way better than anything German soldiers had seen since before the war. Guys wrote home about American chocolate bars that made German Christmas gifts look sad. They talked about piles of medical supplies that could have saved wounded men who died because the Germans had nothing. The Americans wasted more fuel than the Germans ever got their hands on. After a while, the German propaganda ministry just gave up on spinning the North African campaign. Even Goebbels admitted that soldiers who'd seen American supply dumps firsthand couldn't be fooled. Propaganda alone wasn't enough anymore. By May 1943, as the Allies closed in on Tunis, German troops took stock. They were surviving almost entirely on what they'd captured. Enemy fuel, enemy ammo, enemy food. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now completely dependent on whatever they could scavenge. When they finally surrendered on May 13th, it barely felt dramatic. They were out of everything: fuel, ammo, food, and hope. They gave up to an enemy who could afford to be generous because American victory was really decided in the factories long before the last gun fired. General Hans Kramer, the Afrika Korps' last commander, put it simply, "We were defeated by superior material." But that didn't really cover it. The Germans lost to a system that could lose more than they could ever win, waste more than they could ever find, and replace in days what would take Germany months. The Battle of Kasserine Pass gets remembered in the US as a tough loss that forced the army to learn hard lessons about fighting and leadership. Within weeks, new leaders like Patton took over and the army fixed its mistakes: better coordination, more focus, real combined arms tactics. But for the Germans, Kasserine was something else. They won the fight, sure, but the supplies they captured proved they could never win for real. All that fuel and food just bought a few more days while showing that long-term victory was impossible. Years later, German veterans would talk about Kasserine as the moment they realized the war was lost, not because of the battle itself, but because of the sheer scale of American resources they saw in those captured supplies. On the 60th anniversary in 2003, the last surviving German officer from Kasserine summed it up. "We captured enough fuel to run for days, enough food to feast for weeks, enough ammo to keep fighting, but we also captured understanding. The Americans could lose this much without blinking. We couldn't get that much if we tried everything. We were fighting against math, American arithmetic. Those 57,000 gallons of fuel we took, they kept us going, but they also proved we couldn't win. We saw what we were up against, and no amount of courage could change the numbers." Kasserine taught the Americans how to fight. It taught the Germans they'd already lost. Both lessons stuck, but only one was final. When the Germans overran the American supply dumps at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, it was their last real win in North Africa. They took 57,000 gallons of fuel, 183 tanks, 512 vehicles, and mountains of supplies. That haul kept them fighting a little longer. But inside that victory was the seed of total defeat. The supplies made it brutally clear no amount of clever tactics could make up for the gap in industrial power. The Germans weren't just fighting American soldiers. They were up against American factories, farms, and an endless river of replacements. The math was brutal. While Germans cheered over 57,000 gallons of fuel, the Americans shipped in millions more every month. While Germans babied every Sherman tank they'd captured, the US rolled out over 1,000 new ones every month. German soldiers savored stolen rations, but America could feed whole armies and still toss out the leftovers. At Kasserine Pass, the Afrika Korps won a battle and found out they'd lost the war. They'd captured proof that they could never supply themselves. They won a battle, sure, but that win made it painfully clear real victory was out of reach. In modern industrial war, the side that can afford to leave behind 57,000 gallons of fuel will always beat the side that can barely get their hands on it in the first place. Kasserine Pass left two very different marks. For Americans, it stung, a wake-up call that forced them to regroup fast, and eventually it set them on the path to winning the war. For the Germans, it felt like running face first into a brick wall. Skill, guts, discipline, all of that only went so far. None of it could outmatch the cold, hard math of industry. They weren't just fighting soldiers. They were up against production lines and supply chains, and numbers like that don't lie. Those 57,000 gallons of fuel the Afrika Korps captured, that was the real story of World War II. Not who took which hill or won which fight, but who had the sheer industrial power to keep fighting at all. The Germans rolled into those abandoned American supply dumps and found proof they couldn't win. Evidence staring them in the face that the war was lost, no matter how many tactical victories they managed. In that desert, they saw the numbers, and the numbers said the Third Reich was finished.